For many people, when they hear the word Christianity, it conveys pain. It stirs up memories of trauma or memories of rejection. The Christian story, though, is one that describes a God who loves his creation so much that he would die for them. That kind of action affirms value and worth to the creation he died for. But often Christians, whether intentionally or not, find ways to make sure that affirmation gets lost. When people ask questions like, is Christianity a white man's religion, let's say in the context of race, it isn't just a question that someone thought up because they're trying to take a stab at Christianity. It's a question that's birthed out of experiential pain and maybe even trauma suffered by the African American community. If Christianity caused traumatic experiences for you or your past ancestors, it can be impossible to imagine that the Christian God is for you. So is this true? Is Christianity against the African American community? Is it only for a particular race? I think we can actually go to the Bible itself and take a look at Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40 to learn. Through a very unique encounter between two people, what the God of Christianity would answer. In Acts 8, there's an interesting meeting between a man named Philip, a Middle Eastern Jewish man, and an Ethiopian eunuch from Africa. Philip was a Christian who was fervently sharing the life of Jesus and his message with many people. In this particular story, he crosses paths with an Ethiopian who happens to be the treasurer for the Queen Mother of Ethiopia. While not married to the king, this woman was one in a line of Candaces who were famous for possessing immense wealth and carrying out the secular duties of the king, who was considered too holy to do them himself. Suffice it to say, this eunuch was high up in the royal household as he was in charge of great wealth. Before Philip and the Ethiopian meet, the story tells us that this Ethiopian had traveled all the way from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to worship. He was now on his way back home in his chariot, reading the book of Isaiah. He's confused about what he's reading because he doesn't know who this passage is about. Was the author Isaiah, writing hundreds of years prior, actually speaking about himself when he said things like, he was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before the shear is silent, so he did not open his mouth? Or was the author Isaiah speaking about somebody else? It's here that our encounter with Philip and this African man begins. The story tells us that Philip is directly told by God to go to the chariot where the Ethiopian was sitting and stay near it. When Philip obeys, he hears the Ethiopian reading the Isaiah text out loud. Let me pause here, because I think there are some important things to note. First, God directly sends Philip to the Ethiopian. In other words, God intentionally wants this African to know about Jesus. This wasn't some happenstance situation where Philip randomly spoke to a person he didn't know. God deliberately initiated this encounter. Second, the text mentions nothing about Philip feeling awkward about being sent to speak to this African. In other words, we don't have any indication in the text that Philip considered that sharing this Jesus message to an African was odd at all. That's important to note, because there are other times in the New Testament where followers of Jesus wrongfully expressed disdain with having to speak to certain ethnic groups. But interestingly, Philip doesn't hold that perspective with the Ethiopian. So God tells Philip to approach the chariot, and when he does, he hears the Ethiopian reading the text. Philip asks, "Do you understand what you're reading?" The Ethiopian, knowing he needs someone to help explain it to him, is very open and welcoming to Philip's offering of assistance. It's here that Philip then explains to him that the passage is talking about Jesus. This then gives Philip the opportunity to share with this African the story of Jesus' life and his message and offering forgiveness and acceptance to God through his death on the cross. The Ethiopian believed what Philip was saying and was baptized not long after. I find the story fascinating because of the many things that it tells us about race. I already mentioned 2 points previously, which are that God wanted this African to know about him, and Philip didn't feel odd in giving him the gospel. So let's go on to the third. It's interesting to me that this African knew to come to Jerusalem in the first place. For him to leave Ethiopia and embark on this journey says to us that there was some knowledge or texts or words in Africa of the Jewish scriptures already. In other words, those who had access to and read or heard whatever texts were in Ethiopia or Jewish history or story was in Ethiopia would have had awareness of the Jewish God. These teachings were already in Africa before this encounter ever happened. And what those people and the Ethiopian would not have known yet was what had recently happened. And that was the life of Jesus. Hence this divine encounter with Philip. And then fourth, this African receives the gospel message of Jesus from a man who doesn't look like him. In other words, you have a man of one race being ordered by God to give the gospel message to a man of another race. The Middle Eastern Philip to the African eunuch. Is this showing us that God has no problem with a person of one race sharing the message of Jesus with a person of another race? And then finally, who is it that brings the message of Jesus he just learned back to Africa? That Ethiopian. In other words, an African brought Jesus to Africa. This leads us to wonder, is this how Christianity gets to Africa in the first place? Well, Eusebius, a church historian writing in the second book of church history, 113, a few hundred years after this encounter, wrote that the Ethiopian, first among the Gentiles, received of the mysteries of the divine word from Philip. He's said to have been the first on returning to his country to proclaim the knowledge of the God of the universe and the life-giving sojourn of our Savior among men. Well, I only shared with you a snippet of the longer quote. It seems that early on, it was believed that this Ethiopian was responsible for bringing Christianity to Africa. I think the story helps us answer many things about how God views a people group that sadly has oppression as part of their history. Among other things, it lets us know that God intentionally wanted an African to hear the message of Jesus, that there was some understanding of the Jewish God already in Africa, enough for this Ethiopian to embark on this journey, and that it was this Ethiopian who brought the message back to his people in Africa. When God is involved, people's lives are impacted with meaningful affirmation. But when humans get in the way, people's lives are wrought with remorseless inhumanity. I find great hope in this story for all people, but specifically for Africans. The message from God is clear. I want you to know your Creator. I want you to know me because you are valuable to me. Reflecting on this story, the 2nd century North African church father Tertullian wrote that if Philip so easily baptized the Ethiopian, let us reflect that there had been interposed a manifest and conspicuous evidence that the Lord deemed him worthy. That is the same message the Lord has for Africans today. In Acts 1:8, Jesus tells his followers that they will be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. While Christians have brought his message to all parts of this globe, they've not always been his witnesses, meaning living and talking and acting like he did. But the failures of Christians doesn't negate Jesus' desire for all peoples and cultures to know him. In fact, this is what the Ethiopian did. He took that message back to his ends of the earth, which extended the message of Jesus to a people group that God saw, God knew, God loved, and had not forgotten about. Christianity, by God's standards, is not a religion for a race of one.